So, do humans still have advantage over robots, or is the world about to be taken over by robot technology?
It's time for The Line of Fire with your host, activist, author, international speaker, and theologian, Dr. Michael Brown, your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Michael Brown is the director of the Coalition of Conscience and president of Fire School of Ministry. Get into The Line of Fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. That's 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
I am looking at a headline right now. A glimpse of the future. Experts take first steps to create robot strawberry pickers who could end the need for humans toiling in fields. Yeah, this is a headline from the last 24 hours. Is this what's coming? Robots displacing humans, maybe from difficult jobs, maybe from all kinds of jobs? What does the future hold? Yeah, and all caps, robot strawberry pickers. Here's another headline, also within the last 24 hours. This robot will hunt lionfish to save coral reefs. Yeah, I mean, who else is going to do that, right? Underwater, little fish. This robot will hunt lionfish to save coral reefs. What's coming next? Artificial intelligence kind of taking over the world, it seems. I was preaching in Australia a couple years ago and mentioned what was happening in Syria. And suddenly someone's iPhone went on and began to respond, thinking I was calling for Siri. You've heard the stories of somebody's Amazon Echo at home overhearing something on TV and getting online and ordering a product. Smart televisions monitoring what happens in your home. Where are things going? And is there a human advantage over robots? My guest today is Professor Jay Richards. This, of course, Michael Brown. Welcome to The Line of Fire. And Jay's one of these guys who's not just really smart, sharp, well-educated, great Christian perspective, but he's smart, well-educated in the areas that I'm not, which makes him seem all the more smart to me. He is professor in the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, so scientific background as well as economic background, executive editor of The Stream, where I publish virtually all my articles, so hopefully you're at The Stream regularly, stream.org, the host of A Force for Good on EWTN, author of many books, including some bestsellers, but we're focusing today on his new book, The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines. Jay, welcome back to The Line of Fire.
Michael, great to be with you.
So why did you write this book? Always the starting point. Why this book? Why now?
Well, the book initially started out as something called Free to Create. It was really my sequel to another book I had written, Money, Greed, and God, which is really kind of the defense of free enterprise from a Christian perspective. But when I ended that book, I realized that actually the human capacity as creatures made in the image of God to create new ideas was kind of the key and underappreciated economic point. So I always wanted to write something on that. And when I really got down to it, I realized what everyone was talking about, at least in the literature on economics, was this supposed robot apocalypse, that the robots and artificial intelligence were essentially going to take over at least half the jobs in the next coming decade or maybe decade and a half. And I thought, well, that kind of directly challenges the idea of human uniqueness. And so I decided I'm actually going to speak to that and make the case for human uniqueness and human creativity and learned a bunch of new stuff that I didn't know before. So that, I ended up on the other side, as you know, as an author, sometimes there's the book you start out to write and there's the book that you end up with. And this is where we ended up with the human advantage. And of course, it landed just as daily reports tell us about amazing new things that robots are doing or supposedly doing.
I wrote an article a couple months back after getting a new artificial intelligence vacuum machine that plots out the room and sends on the cell phone exactly where it did the work and goes back home to its charger to get recharged before launching out again. And it got me thinking about countries like Japan, where you have an aging population and you now have robots keeping the elderly, giving them company and care and things like that. So it seems that that's the way things are going. So couldn't it be that our human brilliance creates these amazing robots and then we can kind of sit back and just enjoy life?
I think there's something to that. I mean, that's if you read the book, I don't say, well, robots aren't going to do anything. Don't worry. There's no jobs are going to disappear. In fact, I actually think a huge number of the jobs we're doing, that is the ways we're doing things right now, are either going to be transformed or replaced by machines in the next 25 or 30 years. I actually agree on that point. The longer I studied it, the more convinced I became of that. But I also think that that's going to free us up to do other things that we don't do now and that we've never even thought of doing, because we spend our times doing things that, as it happens, we're going to be able to make machines to do. And so the farming, for instance, I actually think robots picking strawberries is a much longer term prospect because it involves complex bodily movements and reaching down for a strawberry. But of course, we already use machines to shake apples loose from trees because that's easy to make machines to do those things. And so what you discover is that there's a lot of things that you might think are really hard, things like winning at chess or beating the world champions at Jeopardy. We can actually make machines to do that, but getting a machine, say, that can do landscaping or fine carpentry, that's actually a much more difficult thing. And so there are going to be all sorts of simple factory jobs, as well as white-collar office jobs from accountants and financial planners that are going to go the way of the dodo bird, I think. Then there are going to be these kind of middle jobs that involve complex bodily skills that are actually going to be around a lot longer than some of the ones that you think we might not be able to take over with machines.
It's interesting you mention that, because we have voice recognition that is advanced well beyond handwriting recognition. And I remember 15 years ago getting a program, and it was going to be the new thing in handwriting recognition, and you had to train it. And I spent days and days and days, and we'd run out of memory each time, and then they just dropped the product. So it is kind of interesting that artificial intelligence does certain things better than others. But ultimately, we want to major on the human advantage issue. And friends, if you have a question about this, be it related to artificial intelligence, be it related to how this works out with the economy, or even larger economic questions about socialism versus capitalism, we're going to take some calls as well, 866-348-7884. And these are subjects I don't speak on much because they're not in my areas of strength. So this is a good opportunity for you to ask someone who's got some expert feedback for you. So you start off the book, how did we get here? In your first chapter, From Hunter-Gatherers to Homeowners, the Evolution of the American Dream. So take us through it. How do we get here, and where did the American Dream come from?
Well, the first American dream that we now call it, that's actually just a term that was coined in 1931, was really the idea of owning a family farm. So many of the immigrants, especially that came from Europe, the Irish, for instance, they were mostly tenant farmers. They were oppressed. Many Irish were starving during the massive waves of Irish immigration. And so they had this dream, even if they landed in New York City or in Boston, of owning a farm. And up until the time of really after the Civil War, that was the kind of key dream for free Americans, was to own their own family farm. You fast forward to the mid-20th century, say 1950, most people weren't thinking that way. In fact, far less than half the population at that time even lived on farms. And so most people were really thinking about a job in a city or a suburb and owning a home. So that then by mid-20th century, over 60% of the population owned homes. Now, if you ask young millennials in their 20s, they don't talk about living on farms. They don't really even talk about owning homes. They talk about something kind of vaguer than that. It's really the opportunity to create value for other people. That's the thing that I hear over and over. And so that's the thing that I think is really important to preserve, not some previous version of the American dream. We want to say, okay, what makes sense given our particular stage of economic development? The other reason to sort of make this historical story right at the beginning of the book is I wanted people to realize that what's happened now has happened other times in the past. This is not the first time when we've been in an inflection point between one type of economy into something that's radically different. Just that move from the agrarian stage, which is where the American founding, where it started. At the time of the American founding, 95% of the population were living and working on farms. Then by 1900, it was half the population. Now, Michael, less than 2% of the population lives and works on farms. And so, in 1776, the skeptic might have said, well, gosh, if farming gets really productive with all these steam engines, then there'll be thousands of people. Most of the population will be out of work and won't have anything to do. Well, yes, there was massive disruption when we moved away from an agrarian economy, but we didn't end up with permanent technological unemployment. What people did is they adjusted and started doing different things, so that now most of the jobs that people do now didn't really even exist at the time of the American founding, and no one could have imagined it. What we're doing right now, no one could have imagined this in 1776 or even in 1800. And so I say we don't actually know what's going to happen in the future because we can't see into the future. And so my argument is that let's just look at other times in history in which economies have transformed radically and say, okay, what happened then? Because there's no reason to think that what's happening now is going to be different in kind. What's different now, if it's anything, is just that the change is happening much more quickly than it has in the past.
Got it. And something I want to come to is I'm just looking at some of the questions being posted on our live stream on YouTube. People are wondering about certain ethical questions or even gospel-related questions that tie in with artificial intelligence, transhumanism. We'll come to that in a bit. But, Jay, I want to make a bold prediction. I'm going to go out on a limb here. As a non-economist and a non-futurist, I'm going to make a bold prediction. Maybe there's someone listening right now, and they're a mechanic, right? And they're thinking, oh, man, you're going to be able to make a robot that's going to be able to repair cars better than me. Right. But my prediction is that this guy could then become a robot repairman. What do you think of that?
That's right.
See that?
That's exactly right.
New jobs.
Yeah, this is what yes, it's a different thing. And it's easy what we do. It's a classic problem in economics called the problem of the seen and the unseen. What we notice, what we see is the job that gets replaced. And we have a hard time picturing the job that pops up as a result of the new opportunities. And that's always the dilemma we're in.
And if you think back, I remember I got my first PC in 1985. So in the business world, they predate that by a good amount. So computers have changed the world dramatically. And yet you now have computer programmers. You have, so again, you can't foresee all of this, but because you are an economist and because you are a futurist as well, looking at implications, looking at how things work on society as a whole, I want to explore these with you. We come back. My guest, Professor Jay Richards, his new book, The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines. If you have a question, you can call 866-348-7884, or you can post it on YouTube or Facebook. We'll try to reply to some of your questions. Just getting started with Professor Richards.
Change the world. Change the world.
When I came to faith in 1971 and the immediate days after that, so I knew there were people that were called to be pastors, and there were evangelists. I knew those too. So the evangelist, that was someone that traveled from church to church, and the pastor was one state of one place. That's what I knew. And then I found out that there's some called to be teachers, that Jesus spent a lot of his ministry teaching, okay, so that was another calling. But I remember asking one day, are there prophets around today? I asked my pastor, do you think there are prophets today? By which I thought of like an Isaiah, maybe in a cave somewhere today with a long beard and a scroll. And he said, yeah, I believe there's some prophets today. And, the question of apostles we didn't really talk about because you had the 12 apostles and that was it. But then you have Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. Ephesians 4:11, speaking of Jesus when he ascended, that he gave the apostles, or he gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, or pastors, and teachers. Now, some say this is what we call fivefold ministry: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. Some say it's really fourfold: apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then pastor/teacher. Do these ministries all exist today? Yes, I believe they do. No, you don't have the 12 apostles or anyone functioning with that same authority today or writing scripture. But do you have people who are called to be apostles, just like, for example, Barnabas is called an apostle in Acts 14? It just means a sent one. These who are foundation layers, who are spiritual fathers, who might be church planters, who might be movement leaders. I believe, say, someone like Hudson Taylor or someone like William Booth. I believe they were apostles, even though they didn't carry that name or have that concept. I believe they are. One of my friends in India who's planted over 7,000 churches, who's planted ministries in other nations, who's built hospitals, who's been a prophetic witness for the Lord, who's almost stoned to death for his faith. We're stoned for his faith. I believe he's a modern-day apostle, even though he wouldn't use that term. And yes, they're clearly prophets today. Read the end of 1 Corinthians 12, and you'll see prophets, apostles, all tied in together with miracles and teachers and administrators and tongues, all tied in together. Thanks, friends, for joining us today on The Line of Fire. This is Michael Brown, my special guest, Professor Jay Richards, his brand new book, The Human Advantage. Jay, as you lay out the foundation, how we got here, your first chapter from hunter-gatherers to homeowners, and then rise of the robots. Will smart machines eat all the jobs? We see little glimpses here and there, maybe a video of a robot running, and look at this, and then we know about, say, robotic technology and developed in Israel, and this little robot goes through your bloodstream and performs surgery, and or it has a camera and things like that. But how far has the technology really gone? As you researched for this book, what did you discover?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I discovered is if you think about artificial intelligence as we experience it, so things like Google, that's the real artificial intelligence that most of us experience every day. It's actually really astonishing. I mean, I find it eerie how good Google is at guessing what it is I'm looking for. But you have to remember, Google is not some computer in a room somewhere. What it is a networked algorithm that networks everybody else using Google. So they type in a question and then they make a choice. And then what you do when you do that is you're teaching Google, in a way, a little piece of information. So the artificial intelligence that we experience in Google is actually a vast, complex, well-designed network of millions and millions of intelligent agents. So we're not dealing with some kind of independent robot. On the other hand, if you think about the sort of most fabulous claims of science fiction, the idea of robots or machines becoming conscious, free agents like we are. Those are, of course, the most interesting movies to watch about this. But there's no reason in the world to think that anything like that is ever going to happen. I mean, there's no more reason to think a computer, if it gets really fast, is going to become a conscious agent than to think that if a tractor becomes really strong, it will become a giant ox. They're just different kinds of things. There's nothing about computation that's happening inside a computer that has any connection with what's happening in the minds of conscious human beings. And that's, I think, where people get mixed up. We experience these amazing things that mimic intelligence because they're designed to do that. And then we make this mental leap based on the movies that we've seen that these things are going to become conscious at some point. And it's a really big philosophical blooper. You can make really strong philosophical arguments for why that's not the case. But I just encourage everyone, sever those ideas in your mind. We're going to get amazing things that mimic intelligence because we've designed them to do so. We're not going to create machines that are literally intelligent like we are.
All right, so there's something unique about human consciousness that does distinguish us not just from the animal world, you're saying, but also from the world of artificial intelligence. So, okay, is this just something, let me play the devil's advocate here. Is this just something you're saying because of your deeply committed Christian philosophy? Is this just some hope you're clinging to that we're different because we're made by God? What if we're just evolved like everything else? Then why couldn't artificial intelligence evolve?
This is, I think, the key question. And as you know, Michael, in the book, I mean, the book's not a Christian book in that it's not published by a Christian publisher.
Yep.
I don't presuppose Christian theology in the book. And so I realized, okay, I could make an explicitly Christian argument against materialism and strong artificial intelligence. But what I do in the book is make what I just consider common sense arguments. Mm-hmm. So you don't actually have to assume that we're made in the image of God. Just take, I say, any person, just take what you already know. You already know that you're a conscious agent. You know that you can affect the material world and move your body around and move things by a conscious choice of will. So you exercise freedom. If you just assume all those things which you know most directly to be true, you already have enough to doubt the materialist superstition that everything can be reducible to blind atoms colliding with atoms and physical laws. You have all the reason in the world to believe that materialism isn't true just from your own existence and experience as a free and conscious agent. Now, I think that all makes a lot more sense in a Christian framework, but I really think if someone's just willing to be honest about what they experience directly about themselves, they already know that they're persons with not just consciousness, but with freedom, with the ability to affect the material world around them. I actually don't think that's compatible with materialism. And in the conclusion of the book, I actually quote the materialist who will tell us that, if materialism is true, there are no persons, our thoughts aren't about anything, there are no moral truths. That's what the smart materialists tell us are the implications of their theory.
And wasn't it a debate you did with Christopher Hitchens, where you kind of just laid out the question, which of these is more logical, which worldview, which discussion of origins makes more sense? So your appeal was just to look at this rationally, and that's your approach here, correct?
It is, exactly. Rather than presupposing the Christian worldview and then arguing against something, which is, I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. That's not what I wanted to do here. I wanted to make a public argument. And so just as I did with Hitchens, I didn't tell Christopher Hitchens that if he doesn't believe in God, he doesn't know that murder is wrong. No, in fact, I said, no, Christopher Hitchens knows perfectly well that murder is wrong. The question is in what view of reality does a moral truth make more sense? In the theistic view, where there's a rational and good God, or it's just all matter, blind matter in motion? So it's not whether the atheist or the materialist can know certain truths. The question is, okay, but if they take that to be true, that they are persons that have freedom, does that really make any sense in a materialistic worldview? I don't think it does.
So a large part of your book, Jay, is devoted to rebuilding a culture of virtue. So you're actually looking at moral issues, moral implications of where things are going with artificial intelligence. And obviously, we rely on it more and more. I know my way around to less places now because everything's GPS, and I don't think about where I'm going to try to remember directions. But you stress the human difference, what only we can do, fear not, courage in an age of disruption. So if we have to rebuild a culture of virtue, what is it that we've lost? What is it that we had that has fallen apart?
It's the institutions that actually inculcate virtue. Because my argument is, I essentially say, look, if we as human beings are uniquely free agents, then we can develop virtue. And what virtue is you focus on an action that you do consciously. Let's say you want to learn to play the piano, so you practice it every day. It starts out just as drudgery, then it becomes a habit, so you kind of do it automatically. And if you keep doing it, it eventually works its way back into your being. So in a sense, you become more than you were before. You have acquired a virtue. And now this is something that normally, little kids, if you just leave them to their own devices, they don't tend to develop these virtues. They develop vices. And so you have to have institutions like families and neighborhood groups and churches and cultures that reinforce these things, because humans all start out as babies. They need to be in other human institutions and social settings that teach them these virtues. And my argument is that, in fact, they're going to be a set of virtues we really need to focus on in order that we can really develop our comparative advantage in a world in which machines do many of the things that previously only we could do. And I think that's the hardest part of the message of the book, is that at just the moment in which things are changing more rapidly than they ever have before, the very cultural institutions we need to develop this new set of virtues are most under attack.
All right. So again, when we put the emphasis on robots can do this and do that, and they'll replace humans, then we forget what humans are really all about. The things that make us special, the things that stand out because we're created in God's image, are not primarily the fact that we have a thumb, and that thumb enables us to do things that other animals can't do, or that we can learn how to use tools better, and so make guns to shoot it. There are other things about us. So just the call for courage, where does that fit in the human advantage?
It fits in, and that's, of course, the first virtue I talk about, because I start out by saying, okay, so what is an information economy really like? And I say, well, it's highly disruptive. It's growing and changing at really exponential speeds. It's digital, which means we're making more and more things out of bits rather than atoms. It's ever more connected and networked, and it's hyper information. Those are all a bunch of big words, but that's what makes the information economy what it is. And then there's a virtue corresponding to each of those things. And so the high disruption, that means there's a bunch of stuff coming into existence, jobs and industries that appear, and then 10 years later, they become obsolete. And so what you've got to have to deal in a world like that is courage. And courage is the willingness to act even with the possibility of failure. So if you're a student just getting out of college, you've got to be willing to try some things. Maybe you get a job in an industry, and then it turns out that whole industry becomes obsolete. You can't allow that to say, well, I guess there's nothing that I can do. You've got to actually be willing to act and to fail and then to try again. So that type of courage actually has always been important, of course, but it's even more important in a world that's highly disruptive, in which you can't count on 4 years of college and then getting a job at an employer and then staying with that employer doing the same thing for the next 40 years. That's just a very unlikely scenario for people that are now in their 20s.
Interesting. And it takes courage to face that, but then that's one of the things that a human being can have that a computer or a robot can't have, despite what we may see in popular movies, TV, or read in novels. All right, Jay, we come back. I want to explore this further. And if you don't mind, just because there's so much discussion now on where things are going, new Democrat candidates really pushing socialism, if you don't mind, if we just take a few minutes to talk about socialism and communism somewhere during this interview, that would be awesome.
Sure thing.
All right, friends, we will be right back with Professor Jay Richards. Again, the new book, The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines. Also, just the very moment I started speaking with Professor Richards, my latest article on the stream went live and appealed to the mainstream media. Own up to fake news. There's a reason so many Americans are highly, highly skeptical of mainstream media today. And by the way, I believe there's bias on the right as well as on the left. But the left needs to own up to its fake news as well. We'll be right back.
Change the world. Change the world.
You know, you often hear the term biblical worldview. But what is a biblical worldview? Okay, a worldview is how we look at the world, how we look at moral, cultural issues, how we look at life, okay? If we were animals, we're going to have a worldview. We're surviving, and some animals eat other animals, and other animals run from other animals, and you don't have a worldview, but we have a worldview. We put value on things. We believe things are right and wrong, and our worldview is based on the Bible being true. Our worldview is based on God creating us in His image, there being right and wrong in His sight, there being absolute moral value. So to have a biblical worldview is to look at the world, to look at culture, to look at family, to look at relationships, to look at decisions we make through the lens of Scripture and through the perspective that we will give account to God and that we live and walk with God here in this world. Now, Paul says something very interesting in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He's talking about the life he once lived, how he once looked at people. Now that he meets Jesus, look at what he says, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16. He said, "From now on, though, having come to know Jesus and being born from above, therefore we regard no one according to the flesh," meaning just on a human level. "Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer." So in other words, he's saying, I once looked at Jesus just in natural terms and didn't realize who he was and completely misjudged him. So if I meet someone, whether it's the President of the United States or a beggar on the street, that's someone created in the image of God who needs Jesus. If I look at some Hollywood celebrity, that's like, oh, can I have your I want to have your autograph. No, rather, how can I lead you to really know the Lord? Because you're a person like everybody else. I'm going to have a different perspective on people, a different perspective on this world, a different perspective on life in the womb, a different perspective on right and wrong. And here's what's interesting. A massive, overwhelming percentage of millennials, I mean, the vast majority, according to polls, do not have a biblical worldview. I mean, like 98, 99% from what I've read, don't have a biblical worldview. Why? Well, obviously, many have not been nurtured in it through their parents, okay? The parents have not done an adequate job of grounding their kids in the Word and in a biblical worldview, or maybe we're just so narrow, quoted the Bible here and there, but never applied it to all of life. And they haven't had that encounter with Jesus that Paul had. I don't mean on the same level, but that same recognition of not looking at things through natural eyes. Many have a heart for justice and want to see good, but they don't get the larger perspective, God's perspective, because of which their worldview is limited. Through an encounter with the Lord and His Word, will have a biblical worldview.
Send it, Lord.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the line of fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
Did you read years ago the Isaac Asimov book, I, Robot, part of his Robot series? Yeah, and then, of course, turned into a famous recent movie, Robots, Artificial Intelligence kind of taking over. Maybe you read Dan Brown's latest novel, Origin, and of course, you can expect the anti-Christian type bias in it, but artificial intelligence takes over there as well. Yet, my guest, Professor Jay Richards, argues that no matter what robots do, and there are a whole lot of things robots can and should do to help the human race and help our planet, human beings have a distinct advantage. A difference between humans and robots is foundational and essential. Jay, thanks for joining us today on the broadcast.
My pleasure, Michael. Good to be with you.
All right, so let's discuss your book, The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines. And let's start to unpack some of the virtues that we're going to have to emphasize. The heart of your book, Rebuilding a Culture of Virtue. We can be connected to the whole world right now and yet live increasingly isolated lives. How is that something we need to overcome?
Well, first of all, we've got to realize that, say, interacting with people on Facebook is just not the same thing as interacting with somebody across your dinner table. I mean, I'm not one of these people that says, oh, gosh, all this stuff is completely useless. Get rid of your phones, get rid of your computers. No, I actually think there's a reason that people like to interact on Facebook. I like to be able to connect with people that I went to high school with that I would have no connection with. And so I see that as an additional way of interacting. The problem is when people allow that to substitute for other much more kind of basic and fundamental ways of interacting. And that's always the case almost with any kind of technology. You could say, well, talking on the phone, for instance, it's not nearly as intimate as talking to someone across the dinner table. On the other hand, before telephones existed, you couldn't talk to people at all that were more than, a mile away, whereas now we can talk to family on the other side of the world. And so I think always when it comes to these kinds of technologies, especially network technologies, we need to see that they're always mixed blessings. They give us new opportunities, but we shouldn't use those opportunities to substitute for the much more basic ways that we still absolutely need to interact. Even when we have 3D holographic images of each other, look like, we're in the same room with each other, that's never going to be an adequate substitute for the much more bodily and human ways that we're meant to interact.
And with that as well, as technology increases and as technology becomes more creative, you would argue that we have to do the same, that we can't be so fragile or so stiff.
That's exactly right. In fact, that's the second virtue I talk about is anti-fragility. And anti-fragility, it doesn't just mean that you're not fragile. It doesn't just mean that you're tough and strong, like a metal ball bearing or something like that. That would be rigid or robust. Anti-fragile is the ability to actually improve when you're perturbed. So it's like the property that muscles have when you go and you work out and you lift weight. If you do it properly, you'll tear down the muscle and create an inflammatory response. But if you rest and eat properly, you actually build up larger, stronger muscles than you had before. That's anti-fragility. And my argument is we need to develop that. It's not just a biological and physical property. It's a type of virtue in which you not only have the courage to try things and maybe fail, but you also cultivate the virtue of learning from failure so that failure actually benefits you in the next thing that you do. That's something we really have to choose to do, because we all know some people who have, they have a setback and they say, "Oh gosh, that taught me something I didn't know before," and then they go on. Other people have a setback, and they use it as evidence that they can never succeed. And the way in which you respond is crucial there, and the way in which you respond determines whether are you going to respond virtuously or viciously to it. That's what separates us from humans from mere machines. We have the freedom to be able to make those choices, and also to allow our choices to shape us so that we actually become more than we were before.
But don't we have a bit of a double whammy here? Because as we develop new technology, it can also create a passivity within us. As I mentioned, GPS, I don't have to think about where I'm going. GPS will just tell me. I don't have to remember this. My calendar is going to remind me. So the more we develop, you're saying that as technology changes, we have to change. We have to look at what God's put within us, which is infinitely better than when we could put in a robot, and rise higher. And yet a lot of the technology we develop kind of puts us to sleep. It's a bit of a challenge.
It is, but what's funny, Michael, is this has always been a challenge. I mean, it's funny because in one of Plato's dialogues, you have Socrates talking about a king who bemoaned the existence of writing. He said, when we have written text, we don't remember things anymore because we can write them down. And that's actually true. If you look at oral cultures that don't have written languages, they can remember entire sagas that we can't remember. And so it's true. In fact, if you can write it down, you tend not to remember it. It's the same thing. You're not going to sort of enhance and refine your direction sense if you're able to use a GPS. And so, again, that's why these technologies are sort of trade-offs. But I don't think anybody would say, well, let's go back to being an illiterate culture because then we'll remember stories better. You just have to do things to counterbalance those things.
Yeah, and you know this far better than I would know it, but what happened during the Industrial Revolution? There must have been the same kind of concerns.
Absolutely. In fact, there were the same kinds of arguments that were happening, that farmers would be left. In fact, if you read this is honestly Marx. If you read Marx in the 19th century, some of the Fabian socialists in the 19th century, they saw people moving from farms to cities. They saw the kind of early stages of industrialization in which you had a lot of poverty. Marx predicted in the Communist Manifesto that the wages of workers in factories was going to keep going down and down and down as factories got more productive. Turns out exactly the opposite happened. In fact, that workers who worked in more advanced factories, that enhances the value of their labor, so they got paid more. And so this prediction has been happening really for centuries in more or less the same form. If you think about it, the first time someone invented a tractor, it made men that were working with mere shovels in some cases obsolete. But it didn't get rid of construction. It didn't destroy all the possible jobs. It just created opportunities, say in farming. Yes, thousands and thousands of family farms disappeared, but the long-term effect was that we spend far, far less on food than people did a century ago, far less. That frees up income and it frees up time for us to do and spend our money on other things. And that's, in fact, what always happens.
And you know what's interesting? I read an article one time saying, what if someone began to predict cars, the effect of cars on America? And the main thing they said is, we will have X number of people die every year because of these new contraptions. Everyone would say, we're not going near that. But then someone else needs to say, we will save like 50 times the amount of those lives with ambulances and fire trucks and everything else, and improve life. So that's the thing. We can often focus on the fearful part, which, there may be valid concerns to raise, but we forget, again, the name of your book, The Human Advantage. Jay, in a book like this, where you talk about smart machines and where things are going, it's surprising that you end the book with a focus on how to pursue happiness. So how does that tie in with your larger theme?
Well, honestly, I mean, the reason that most people are concerned about these economic questions, Michael, is because if you're an American, it's because usually you kind of hope, am I going to have a decent life? Not just sort of happiness in some abstract kind of mental or immaterial sense, but just basic, this worldly happiness where I have a family and I can afford the things that I need and I'm not constantly worrying where I'm going to get rent payments. And these are just kind of basic things that are perfectly legitimate things for people to worry about. And the idea of the American dream is actually it's less historic than this idea of the pursuit of happiness, of course, which Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, he says that we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when people hear happiness these days, we tend to think of that as sort of short-term sensual pleasure in a sense. But if you actually look at the classical definition of happiness, it's like the word blessed in the New Testament. If you look at Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas' definition of happiness, they're talking about what they call eudaimonia, which is really the word we use now is flourishing, but it's kind of a fully lived, flourishing life in which our bodily needs are met, but also our mental and intellectual and spiritual needs are met. And so my argument is that if you understand happiness properly, the